Will we have success?
If that's much to ask,
Yes, we
what
do.
pronouns
Okay.
does Gabe prefer?
One sec.
If that's much to ask,
Yes, we do.
what pronouns
Okay.
does Gabe prefer?
Okay. The audio is good enough, I think. Okay. Sorry. Can you repeat what you said?
I was just asking. Sorry, I was just asking what pronouns Gabe goes by.
Oh, good question.
I'm he, him. I'm cooking dinner right now, and then I've got to go uh, put my son to sleep. So I was just kind of checking in on where you guys were. I am occasionally free on Thursday nights, but I have a 1 year old, so it's just whatever's going on with him.
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, thanks for joining us. We're just getting started. We're about, I thought it was a third, but it's probably more like realistically a fourth of the way through Heidegger's phenomenological interpretation of Kant's critique of pure reason. We've talked a lot about um, the what Heidegger thinks of being, of ontology, how it's a sort of not quite a givenness because Heidegger rejects the subject object division. It's more of it's actually pretty much exactly like a thrownness that he describes in Being in Time. So it may like appear is given, but really you're a part of it too. So it's all just this sort. You find yourself always already in this what seems to you like maybe a stream of time, but then we get in the topics of like memory and historical past and anticipating the future, which especially Husserl talks about a lot. Heidegger's teacher, and arguably the founder of phenomenology. Um, so it's sort of starting out in this simple kind of you wake up and boom you're in the world and then just kind of extrapolating. That's a lot of what Being in Time is about, but that's kind of how he approaches ontology in general, and specifically where we're heading with this now is interpreting Kant's critique of pure reason in that way, looking for a possible grounding of that maybe in sort of a Kantian historical philosophical tradition, um, and then also how that interacts with the philosophy of science, which is actually really what we're going to get into in this section that we're about to see now, the relation between
Yeah.
the founding of science and
We've talked
philosophy.
about this a lot.
What's that?
Oh, sorry. I was just saying that we've been talking about this a lot in general about the relationship between science and philosophy. Matt and I for the past several months.
Yeah, yeah, this has definitely been on the mind. Yeah, could be worth noting that neither Kirk or I are particularly Heideggerian. So,
Yeah.
but
It's important. He's an important thinker.
yeah, and I use this work a lot in my thesis. Um, and I find it really interesting because later on he goes on to develop this notion of syndosis, which I find really the most direct response to what he thinks is wrong with Kant, because for Kant the fundamental ground of intelligibility um, for anything experiential or synthetic a priori is the synthesis of the unity of opperception. So Kant takes that as pretty foundational for any pretty much any epistemology. And then and then that's where Heidegger splits. He goes, nope. What's fundamental is what he calls a syndosis. It's that kind of just. It's so hard to even describe in like any metaphysical word, but it's just that what I described before of that being thrown, and that's really where subjectivity first finds itself in a sort of initial abstraction of that what he calls a like a primordial syndosis, and it's temporal. It's this sort of like simultaneous past present future that's always like going in and out of itself, a kind of really oscillating insane like temporal structure, I guess. And then the subject kind of is like a sort of abstraction that then like reimmerses itself. It's freaky, and I just find it so cool, and it's really well described in this specific work. So that's what I find fascinating about it personally, and that's what I used a lot of in my own thesis. In I just graduated with my degree in philosophy, so I wrote a lot about that. So
Yeah.
yeah, okay. Hopefully that's just helpful for some more general context of at least what I'll
Just
be
one thing.
looking out for. What's up, Kirk?
I was just say just one thing. Sorry for butting in, but I just want to say, just to clarify for the audience, if you're not familiar with Heidegger's philosophy, when we're talking about temporality, we're not talking about physical time like Einsteinian space time. We're talking about basically the phenomenology of time, like the time as it presents to us in a world of meaning, as I understand it. Basically,
Yeah,
oh, I just did an echo.
yeah. I think that's correct. Which is a good distinction to make because we've talked a lot about
Yeah,
scope and
but
understanding who's saying what, and so if
yeah,
someone says time,
exactly.
right? Yeah, they might think they're talking
Yeah,
about empirical science or something.
yeah.
Although I
I
think
don't want to
Heidegger
get in.
himself is going to make that quite clear.
Yeah,
So that's
and
good.
I don't.
But yeah, it's good to know in general. So thanks, Kirk.
And I was just gonna say, and I don't want to get too, I don't want to talk about this too in depth now, but I'll just say my own perspective is Heidegger does not have the problem of like how to reconcile it with Einstein, because Heidegger I think is talking about a different thing from Einstein, but I actually interpret Kant as talking about the same thing as Einstein. But that's a disagreement between Matt and I. We won't get into it now, but I'll just say if for future studies we might talk about that. So keep watching the channel, see how these discussions happen.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And then they might come up even in this. I don't know if in this session. I don't know how far we'll get, but certainly when we get to the issues of synthesis and time, and we can see how Heidegger represents Kant, and we'll get into what I think about Kant, and maybe I'll pull up my thesis and we'll investigate that section. I don't know. I'm excited, but yeah. So these are good thoughts to have stirring in the back, and good things to look forward to. I think this is all great stuff. So okay, I think we're ready to get started. If anyone would like to read, who's not me, feel free. It sounds like Gabe
Uh,
is
yeah,
occupied, but maybe I don't know. Kirk, do you want to read?
Yeah, I'll read because I think Gabe has his kid, but I'll read. So you want me to start from B, the relation between the founding of science and philosophy?
Yeah, yeah. That's where we're picking up from last time.
Okay. A science of beings is founded in objectification. That is, by the basic act of opening up the ontological constitution of the being, which is to be circumscribed as the object realm of the particular science. Is this self-founding of the science, which occurs in the beginning, already a founding of science? Yes and no. Yes, insofar as science obtains its basis and realm by opening up the ontological constitution general. No, insofar as precisely such an opening within the particular science pushes against a necessary limit, i.e., insofar as the self-founding of science requires a more original founding. The founding of the projection of the origin ontological constitution of the field of science, a projection that science itself makes, cannot be accomplished by the sciences themselves, and it is in accord with the way in which this founding comes forth that science itself cannot do it. In order to clarify this, we ask, to what extent does the self-founding of science, the opening of the ontological constitution of its field, as this opening is enacted by science, come up against a necessary limit? Of what kind is that founding which is demanded by science itself? I believe this is. You want to continue reading?
Well, let's try to break down by paragraphs, just because I think that's helpful, so we don't get lost. Especially with someone like Heidegger, who tends to talk in a way that was very popular at the time, is just to kind of keep referring to the same terms over and over again, and so if you don't have one part, you're gonna get lost real quick. So let's break this down. I mean, a lot of this is what we've been talking about. I think just kind of said in a new way, right, or maybe a more elaborate way. So right, there's every particular science is an object realm. Um, so then the question, right, is this self-founding of the science which occurs in its beginning already a founding of science? So I guess the question there, right, is a science's initial demarcation, which is kind of its own thing, right? Because it begins with its own question, I think is the logic, right? Because let's say you're like a biologist, right? biology isn't made yet, but you're maybe the founder of biology, right? I mean, it's kind of a crude example, but let's just go with it for the conceptual understanding. And the reason you're the first biologist is because you're walking around, right, in the primordial, being, right, and you're thrown into the world, and you look at a bug, right, and you're like, or a plant or something, a particular, like right, thing you would find in nature, right, like a bug, a plant, a creature, and you're like, what the hell is that? Where did it come from? And like, why is it different than me? And then you could ask, like, well, what am I in relation to this, particular being? And so that's the initial founding of the science, right? It's a self-founding because it's launched by its own questioning, which is already within its own field. So in that sense, it's a self-founding. So I think that's what he means by self-founding. And let me know if that doesn't make sense. But then he goes on to say, is this a founding of? Is it a founding of science already? Like, I think he means science in general. Yes and no. Science obtains space in the realm by opening up a ontological constitution in general, right? So you're thrown into the world, and you do open up, right? Because within being thrown into the world, it's not like you're making up that these creatures exist, right, or these plants exist, right? They do really factically, right, to use another important Heidegger word, right? They do factically exist. So it is an opening up of the ontological constitution, but at the same time, it's a closing off. And that's what he's talking about, right? It pushes against the limit, right? You're not going to know what, for example, like, let's just say, you're like some sort of, right, cave person, right? And you're asking these questions about these creatures and stuff, but then you go back to your cave, right? And you have like cave mates and they're drawing a picture, right, on the cave wall. And then boom, there you have a sort of language, right? And meaning, right? And representation. And that's totally different, right? If you ask, like, well, what does that mean, right? However you would do that to yourself, right? If you just have that initial kind of quizzical approach to that cave painting, that's a lot different than asking, what that tiger was, or what that plant was, and where it came from, right? Way two different fields, right? So there are limits and there are closings off.
Yeah.
Right, multiple closing offs. So this leads to the question: to what extent? So that can't answer to be the sciences themselves. So what extent does the self-founding of science come up against the necessary limit? Of what kind is that founding demanded by science itself? So, we get this question. Why, right now that we have these two different sciences, we can take a step back and say, well, what the hell's going on here? Why is the interpretation of the tiger and the plants different from what my caveman friend drew me? Or in today's, Western academia terms, right? Why is natural biology different than linguistics or something, right? So that's the kind of question we're asking here.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, if I can give my thoughts on this, I
Mm-hmm.
think that yeah, it's interesting. I think the history of science is interesting. I did start reading the Thomas Kuhn book named "The Structure of Scientific Revolutions." So for anyone who's in the audience who's not familiar, it's a book about the history of science and philosophy of science. I only read a little bit of it, so I'm not sure about it. But as I understand it, from the little I've read and then watching lectures about it, he's kind of talking about something a little bit similar, which is basically paradigm shifts, which is basically how the axioms of science sort of self-justify themselves by limiting themselves from other fields, and how when a paradigm shift happens, you have basically the axioms of a scientific theory or a scientific paradigm changing because new evidence or new way of thinking about things comes. But I think that the convergence here is basically an emphasis on like like you might say historicity, or the historical development of these things. And I think that this is kind of one of the disagreements that Matt and I have, is that, like, as I understand it, Matt thinks like what's really important about understanding the philosophy of science is like the history of science, whereas I'm more interested in like the demarcation and methods of science. And I think like probably Matt would probably be closer to Heidegger here than I would be.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I mean,
Well, I'm not sure to what extent that the methods versus the historical understanding are totally different, but but maybe what you're getting at is, yeah, I think Kirk's interested in more of a sort of like formal analysis of the conceptual aspects of the methodologies of science, whereas I sort of look at the historical developments of these initial like conceptual uh, uh, developments and consider that, in conjunction
Yeah.
with what the concepts actually are, to sort of give like a new meaning to those concepts in general. So
Yeah, that's what I generally mean by like difference between the history and method. Is like I'm more interested in like it's like what exactly is science and what are the methods it uses. But specifically, I mean questions like probability theory and mathematics and like machine learning and like statistics and like this like more probabilistic mathematical way of viewing things. Whereas I think Matt is more interested in like the like correct me if I'm wrong, but the more historical like how did these mathematical things even come up to begin with, and what power dynamics or what historical phenomena led to it.
yeah, again, I'm interested, but it's a conceptual history, right? So it's not just like a pure like set of facts, right? It's there's a line of logic to that, and
Yeah,
and I think Heidegger is probably gonna talk about that, but maybe even not to the extent that I would. So so yeah, so these
yeah,
are all different viewpoints to consider, I think, and I think we should probably just keep it going so we can see what Heidegger's gonna
yeah.
say. Does that sound good?
Sure, if I can read that would be great.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I believe this is lowercase alpha.
Yep.
Um, Alpha, the limit of science's self-founding. By opening up the ontological constitution of a field, for instance, the field of nature, there is a reflection on what a being is and how it is and how it is. Understanding of being becomes explicit in certain areas, at certain aspects, sorry. And this understanding understands how to conceptualize what it understands. To open up the ontological constitution of the region nature means to circumscribe the basic concepts belonging to this field, such as motion, body, place, and time. But the respective circumscription of the basic concepts of a science reaches only as far as the specific task of the science um, demand, e.g., as required by the task of investigating bodies in motion in space and time. This means that whereas the physicist defines what he understands by motion and circumscribes what place and time mean, whereby he relies in part on ordinary concepts. Still, however, he does not make motion's way of being a theme of his investigation. Rather, he examines only certain movements. The physicist does not inquire into the own most inner possibility of time, whereas he uses time as that with respect to which he measures motion.
Okay, so that's the end of a paragraph, but I
Yeah.
think we already also have good topics for discussion, right? Because we were just talking before, right, about Heidegger and his possible relationship to, you know, theories of time that come from the field of physics, right?
Yeah.
So he's already demarcating that difference. Um,
Yeah. And believe it or not, sorry, go ahead, or can I just
I was just gonna break down more of what he says in the paragraphs in more detail, but yeah, you can go ahead first if you want.
I was just going to say, believe it or not, I do think so. When it comes to like time, like as a physical quantity, I accept the Aristotelian definition of like time as a measurement of motion. As I understand it, that's how Aristotle defined time. But when we're talking about the phenomenology of time, I'm not like a strict Heideggerian because I haven't read enough Heidegger to know, but like I do think there is something true to the idea that there is something qualitatively different about time as phenomenologically experienced. So I would say that demarcation is a legitimate one. I just don't know if I would fully agree with Heidegger's formulation of it.
Right, because his is certainly. I mean, he says it right here, right? Heidegger thinks that there's, or at least he implies it right here, right? Heidegger thinks that there is something more fundamental, more fundamental about the possibility of time itself, right? The inner possibility of time. So he thinks that there's something about time, right? Namely, its inner possibility that the physicist doesn't have access to, um, or even like an Aristotelian, right? Doesn't have access to. So, right, and right, but they do have access to this, right? Which, like Kirk said, is Aristotle's conception of time. So, um, Yeah, that's all. That's going to be something Kant and Heidegger share. We're going to see as this goes on, and as he brings up Kant more. There's a lot more in common, I think, with Kant and Heidegger than maybe people think. Well, I don't really know a lot of what people think about the relationship between Kant and Heidegger, so maybe I'm wrong. But at least there's more in common with them than I thought going into it. So this is something that they're
Yeah.
going to share. Although how they're going to share it is certainly different, the details, and so ultimately I guess they are different on the issue, but they're very similar in that they're both opposed to this kind of physicist position that Kirk was just talking about.
Yeah. And
Yeah, you can go ahead.
sorry, I was just gonna say, and this also is kind of reminding me. Like I said, I've only read a little bit, but from what I understand about part of Spinoza's philosophy is that every determination is a negation. So I think Heidegger has a sort of, at least conceptually, similar idea to Spinoza here, where it's basically every determination you give that. So science gives determinations, but they negate being as such. The only difference is that for Heidegger, being as such is not a being like Spinoza thought, whereas it's a transcendental condition for beings, where Spinoza thought, as I understand it, that capital B being for is more like God or substance. So Spinoza was more of a substance ontologist, Heidegger was not a substance ontologist, but they did kind of agree that like any determination you give will inherently limit it from being as such, as I understand it.
Right, yeah, Spinoza was a monist, which I've only actually just kind of clicked to me, I think the other day, how much the debate about like substance and it's like, basically it's quantity, right, is actually in what would be the phrase, like steeped within the geometrical mathematical tradition that Spinoza was working in. So I don't know, the realization of that just kind of blew my mind. Well, and the way I got there was just thinking about like, oh well, it's kind of funny how like, for example, monism versus dualism is just a debate between one and two. Well, actually, not just. That's actually completely incorrect. It's not just a debate between one and two, but the fundamental element of that debate is the debate between one and two. So it's like, oh, those are like quantitative concepts that Spinoza just kind of helps himself. Of course, it's a little more nuanced in Spinoza, but
Yeah.
I just think it's funny how people, you know, are arguing about fundamental ontology, and part of that is just one and two, and then but nobody's asking about what the hell one and two is. So I just thought, but Heidegger is someone who would do that, and most post Kantians are. So I just thought that was a really interesting kind of thing, specifically with mathematics, and you can get into the philosophy of mathematics through that. Hegel has like a whole section on quantity and science of logic, which would be really interesting to look into. But yeah, I just figured I'd bring that up because that's something that kind of struck me the other day. Well, yeah, I didn't consciously know that as much as I did until a few days ago. So I just found that fascinating. But
Yeah.
okay, wait, somebody, I heard music.
Sorry, Mr. Not Real.
Oh, it's Dean.
Or Mrs.
Hello, Dean.
Oh, Dean.
Hello, Matt.
We're reading Heidegger. Have you come to read with us?
I can read a bit, but also, I want to know your weekend plans.
Oh, yeah. I will. I'm coming on Saturday afternoon.
Yeah. Also, I can hear a piano in the background.
Oh, it's guitar.
Yeah.
You're coming Saturday afternoon.
Yeah. I've got a volunteering shift in the morning, so I'll just head over after that.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So right. So those are some interesting
Sorry to
considerations.
interrupt.
What's up?
Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. So, right. So he differentiates himself from the physicist and the physicist's understanding of time, and the logic behind this position. Right. He kind of says here is that it opens up the ontological constitution, but then it doesn't fully take up what that means within the greater context of being. Maybe is a
Yeah.
good way to understand it, right? He says, but the respective circumscription of the basic concepts of a science reaches only as far as the specific tasks of the science demand. right? So it's a kind of asking, right? So when right if we go back to that example where you're that sort of primitive cave person, right? And you're asking about what this creature is or what this plant is, that's a specific question. So the question itself comes with limitations,
Yeah,
and so it can you are then restricting yourself to a certain set of concepts and a certain set of tools for understanding. So that's the
yeah,
idea behind Heidegger's logic about why he thinks the physicist is limited in their understanding of motion. They have motion certainly as one of their fundamental tools, but it can be really easy. I think as anyone who's dipped their toes into philosophy and science, right? And then it's like, oh, but they're both talking about motion and they're both talking about time, and it gets really, really confusing really quickly. And because they're both such kind of fundamental questions in their own way, it can be really easy to think that they're the same thing. But Heidegger's saying, no, listen, there's a fundamental limit to a physical question. And then you can, go a step further, right? And ask what it means. Um, Wait, what does he say? He says something really, really good. Uh, right, being a theme of his investigation, right? So it's this kind of capability of being reflexive, right? It's like can you ask what motion even means? Boom. That's a then right there you're breaking the boundary and you're breaking out of physics as such.
yeah.
So that's the first at least part of his argument. Are you gonna say something,
Just
Kirk?
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to say, this kind of reminds me of a discussion I have with sometimes when I'm talking with debating with someone who's like one of these like analytic physicalist philosopher types that's like, or self-described philosopher types. I don't even think really a lot of them are like real philosophers. But like whenever I'm talking to one of these online people who says, "Oh, I'm a physicalist," because there's no evidence that the mind is anything but physical. But like to the Heideggerian point here, I think he would argue like the very idea that like what exists or being is what you can provide evidence for is so loaded with assumptions that it's like so beyond what real philosophy is about.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because the physicalist in this case is helping themselves to a preconceived notion of evidence, right? And thereby a notion of truth and a notion of logic, right? And all these things. So Heidegger, right? Heidegger's really saying,
Yeah, and
hey,
this is actually what I agree with him about. Like, I used to be one of these guys or one of these people. I guess I'm non-binary, so whatever. But like, I used to be one of these people who thinks like, basically what exists is what has evidence for them. But like, yeah, I think that's really now I think that's really a shallow way to think. Not that I'm a Heideggerian, because like I do have independent things. Like I do think there are philosophical arguments beyond his, but like I do think that he's right here that like the idea of basically positivism or the idea that like only what can be measured is what exists is just such a shallow way of thinking about things.
yeah, and that's interesting because he actually, in Being in Time, he goes into measurement specifically as a sort of the way of tackling this issue. So that's something interesting to check out if you're interested specifically in the notion of measurement and of space. Okay, let's move on. Kirk, do you want to keep reading?
I mean I can keep reading unless you want to keep reading, or unless you want to read.
Hmm.
Okay, I'll read.
Somebody read.
Yeah, sure. While the inquiries and investigations of the physicist in respect to his object, physical beings, have their own determination and certainty, he becomes insecure in his deliberations about space, time, and motion because his methods fail him here. The result is that he turns away from further reflection on generalities to which basic concepts refer. The same thing is shown in other sciences in different ways. What pertains to the ontological constitution of the being called life is largely underdetermined, and yet the biologist cannot do without the so-called general concept. Similarly, what pertains to non-historiographical historicality, um, I have no clue how to pronounce this Roman word, in general is unclear
Geschicklichkeit.
of historical sciences and the history. Most of this, and in its relation to the basic concepts of language itself, operate with an undefined generality. Here, a certain justifiable timidity of the researchers precludes an inquiry into these so-called generalities. They are confronted with an awareness which has not been clarified, that with respect to the basic concepts of their science, the methods of this science fail. The basic concepts of philology cannot be classified with the help of philological methods, and the basic concepts of history cannot be determined by researching the sources, let alone be grasped by such research.
Yep. I really think this is just more examples of what we were talking about. Um, does anybody have any comments on it specifically, or should we just keep moving?
I think we should just keep moving.
Okay. Do you want to keep reading?
I mean, unless you do.
Okay, yeah, sure. I'll read for a bit. On the other hand, the insight is gradually emerging that the real development and history of a science cannot be accomplished with that discovery of new facts, but rather in recasting the basic concepts of that science, i.e., in the transformation of the understanding of the ontological constitution of a particular field. Kirk, maybe this is like what Thomas Kuhn was talking about, right? It's a sort of just transformation, right, in an understanding that could.
Yeah. I mean, it's very similar. Very similar, at least as far as I can know. But again, I've only read a little bit of Kuhn, so I can't say for sure.
Yeah, well, I just specifically the word transformation stood out to me in that way. Right. Yeah. So it's not just a gathering of facts, right? It's actually, well, since this is a paragraph technically, I guess we can follow our rule, right? And which is just a rule of thumb, of course. But I just think it's interesting, right? Because we were talking about AI before the stream started, and this is, I think, probably what one of the key points that Heidegger would launch against AI, or at least how it's been like culturally received, right? People are thinking AI is such a breakthrough, and maybe in some ways it is, but people are really asking fundamental philosophical questions about it, and even taking it to be the answer to those questions, when really, especially from a Heideggerian perspective, right, all AI is doing is just discovering. It's not even really discovering new facts. It's kind of just reintroducing facts in a more accessible way, which of course has its own value, and that's a lot of even what education itself is, which, by the way, is probably why education is getting so fucked right now from AI, because people are finding out that, oh well, yeah, it can kind of just recapitulate facts, and that's kind of what we've been doing, and so people are reapproaching education fundamentally, which I think is actually probably in the long run a good thing, but and to make it more about actual discovery as opposed to just recapitulating facts, right? But even then, the most we could rely on AI for doing is discovering new facts, right? At least with the AI that we see now and know now, that people are freaking out about, right? But for Heidegger, this is no reason to freak out, right? Because it doesn't actually grasp the it can't actually transform one's ontological constitution, right? It can just take in pre-existing ontological constitutions and just spit equivalent things or corresponding things back out to you, right? It's not going to actually take into account the foundations of what it's doing and reconstitute itself in a new way.
Yeah, and I would actually push back a little bit on Heidegger here, or at least your interpretation of Heidegger, because basically I do think I mean, it depends on the AI, but I don't know. Have you paid attention to the do you know any of the big names in the AI research world, like LeCun, for example, or anyone else? I don't know if you've been paying attention to that at all.
Not quite. I've heard of is Palantir a person or a company?
I think it's the name of a company, but
okay,
basically the thing is, when we're talking about these things, there is a sense in which they do the discovery, which is for I think the name of the concept is unsupervised deep learning, but it's basically for some branches of machine learning, they have it such that they go out to their environment and then construct basically a schema of the world based on their interactions with their environment, and then basically construct new facts by interacting with the environment. And that's what the robots do, because they're trained on feedback loops, and you mentioned Nora Wiener before, cybernetics, right? And so these things, they are built in some of the AI systems with world models. It's not getting at being as such, right? So Heidegger is right here, but I'm saying they can discover new facts about the natural world if you have a certain mathematical formulation for them.
Well, that's the distinction I'm trying to get at. Sorry if that was unclear. They can discover new facts, certainly. I mean, what it's most popularly used for right now, at least what I've seen culturally, right, is the recapitulation of facts. But yeah, right. At its most advanced, at least as we know now, or at least with what you brought up, Kirk. Right. It's a discovery of new facts. So it can discover new facts that we don't know about. Heidegger's point, though, is that it can't really transform a science, at least on its own. Right. It's not gonna do this process that he's described. Right. Where you call into question, I guess in this case, right, it's a mathematical, right, because wasn't the condition you provided, Kirk, right, is that it needs a like a preloaded mathematical model or something, right? So
Yeah,
it
I
can't.
mean,
But Heidegger's point is that it can't transform that on its own, right?
oh, so is he just saying that it doesn't have like volition? Because then I would agree with that.
I mean, yeah, I guess if that's what you mean by volition, sure, yeah, yeah, because that's what Heidegger's saying. That's what the history of science and develop, at least what he says here, right? A real development. That's what a real development is, according to Heidegger here, right? It's where you it's where you stop using merely the tools of your pre in the context we were just talking about, right? The preloaded investigation, right? And you take a step back and you say, whoa, what are these tools that I'm using? Interesting, and then boom, it's a transformation, right? And so
Yeah.
that's when a science that's what constitutes for Heidegger development in science is when we really stop just using the tools we have for granted, and we can take a step back and we can question the tools and the greater context, right, which Heidegger thinks is within being, right, capital B. So
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's basically, um, sorry, go ahead. Will you
no, that's it.
finish up the thought? Yeah, I was just gonna say, basically that is basically, yeah. It does sound similar to Kuhn, and it does sound similar basically, like when you look at the history of science, yeah. Like for example, you had for thousands of years before Darwin and before I think the name is Mendelian, like Mendelian genetics. Before them, you had basically like a creationist view, but then Darwin basically completely rechanged what biology even means by thinking about things in a completely different paradigm of like natural selection, right? So, but basically, what you're saying, as I understand, is that like AI can't be like one of these scientific revolutionaries that thinks in a new way because it can only go on existing data. And so, yeah, AI can discover new facts within a given field, but it can't create a new field itself.
Right, yeah, exactly. Cool. Here, I can keep reading. uh, all of this makes clear that the self-founding of the sciences do, which is necessary and justified within science. This self-founding falls into ambiguity and uncertainty. Certainly, there is no secure method for inquiring into what is meant by the basic concept as such. Suddenly, there is no ground for demonstrating these basic concepts themselves, i.e., that is, for genuinely grounding these concepts. Put positively, what is meant by the basic concepts points to broader and narrower possibilities for a new determinability. Put differently, science is self-founding, which occurs in an opening up and projecting the ontological constitution, needs in turn a founding which the science, with its own methods, obviously can no longer achieve. This necessary founding of science as self-founding is actually the laying of the foundation of science. Okay, what the hell is happening here? Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to and whoever else to to modern philosophy, basically, because this was in a way Descartes' worry, and this extends all the way through Kant and through Fichte. This pretty much paragraph could also sum up. Well, minus the ontological projecting and opening up in Constitution, but everything else pretty much is what you find in the beginning of Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre, right, the science of knowing, and Schelling wants to know what's going on between the world and its founding and the two different ways of knowing that he describes in at least the system of transcendental idealism, which is transcendental idealism and then empirical science, and then Hegel, right, further messes with those two poles, right? And talks about the inverted world and the phenomenology, and so and so all of this kind of historical development of German idealism and neo-Kantianism here into phenomenology is all about principled reasoning. And it's like, well, what the fuck is science? and what is, Kirk, we were talking about this the other day, right? Certainty. How can I have certainty in my science? How can I know what these methods that I'm using are actually giving me factual information about the world? And I think Descartes is probably the most simple way to understand this worry, right? His worry is, how do I know I'm not dreaming? Right? He's like, I can be confident to an extent in my, ways of knowing, the world that I experience and the what I'm living around me. But in what sense is this actually true? Like, how do I know I'm not just being deceived, right? Because this happens, right? For example, pseudoscience, right? You can have a group of pseudoscientists, right, doing something that they are totally convinced by, right? Because it's working by their own methods. And then you can have someone come in and say, no, this is actually just completely wrong. You're working from the totally wrong foundation. And, that's one thing on its own in a kind of formal sense. But, if you've ever lived out that experience, that's terrifying. Somebody's telling you your whole worldview is completely fucked and incorrect. And then you're like, who am I? What am I doing? And it's horrible. It's traumatic. It's terrible. And so that's the worry. That's the kind of Cartesian worry and the Cartesian stakes that this whole tradition is founded on. And Heidegger here is still caught up with that. I mean, he's not approaching it as with much fear, at least openly, as Descartes was, right? Descartes, poor Descartes didn't know if he was real. Well, eventually he thought he was, but how do we know we're real? How do we know that anything we've come to know, there's the sciences, right? Theology used to be a science, right? So in Descartes' time, that was doubted, right? Physics, how do we know that the physics has changed a bunch? How do we know Newton is right? A lot of people think Newton was wrong now because they found further foundations of physics, and so what the hell? When is somebody right? When is somebody wrong? This really lays a real epistemological doozy in the way of things. So that's what's going on here. That's kind of how I would but of course we're approaching this through the lens of science in this particular text right now. So even if you don't want to take it as that existentially scary, it's just like, well, yeah, how do we know a scientist is right and another scientist is wrong? How do we know physics is more fundamental than chemistry and biology, like a lot of people claim it is? How do we even order sciences? How do we make sense of any of that? That's a lot of what's going on here. Okay, I kind of talked a lot for, I think, an idea that's not super complex. What's up, Dean?
Well, Matt, I am a scientist. I seek to understand me.
True.
You
You know
a
what's
scientist,
right,
for
Dean.
real?
You know what's right.
I am all of my impurities and evils yet unknown.
But what about the clues?
For what I search and choose to abuse, just unlock my mind.
Yeah, we got to
What kind of
unlock
science
the
do you
mind.
work on?
No, it's a song.
Oh, sorry.
But it's
I
a
didn't- I
truth
didn't get the
nuke. That's what Heidegger's saying. We have to. How do we know what to choose to imbue and abuse to unlock our minds? Our minds are locked by science. How do we unlock that?
That's true.
How do we access being qua being? How do we even know of our impurities and evils? How do the unknown evils become known? This is all at stake, as Robert Pollard knew well. He was a philosopher of science.
Paul.
So
He read Heidegger on the back of his beer cans.
probably, yeah. It's gonna be me. That guy's my hero. Okay, Kirk, do you have anything to add in this paragraph?
No.
All right. Do you wanna take reading back, or should I keep going?
You can go.
Okay. Beta. This is the beta section. Founding of science as regional ontology. Founding of the ontological inquiry in philosophy as fundamental ontology. As my professor Simon Critchley likes to say, Heidegger doesn't have a talent for titles. he just kind of says they're all themes. They're just themes, and they're very long, complicated or at least in terms of how they're presented. Okay. In what follows, we shall try to elucidate the meaning of the founding of science as self-founding that is required by science. We saw that sciences of beings do not reflect on the basic concepts. The more reflection tries to capture what is meant by the basic concepts as such, the deliberations on the so-called generalities up against which the sciences come, but more unsteady and obscure. What is meant by these concepts is the ontological constitution of beings, and not beings themselves, in their existing context. The scientific methods have been developed precisely in order to explore beings, but they are not suited for examining the being of these beings. If this is to happen, then what we need is not to objectify a being, for example, the existing nature as a whole, but the ontological constitution of nature, or the being of that which exists as historical. Now that's really interesting, Kirk, because here we have a direct linkage between the historical and the ontological as such, which I know you probably have your issues with, right?
Well, actually, I mean, it depends. Like, I think so. I mean, my own view is that I do think we do have this historical development of science. So, like, for our, like, an epistemological perspective, how we understand being is going to be historically contingent. But I do think for either through philosophical arguments or scientific inquiry, we can transcend our historical limitations.
Yeah, well, this is kind of the radical break of Heidegger, right? Is that what is, well, maybe not the break, because other philosophers have argued this, but Heidegger's doing it in a uniquely phenomenological way to say that what is ontological is historical, which is really interesting because that means you can't get any, it's in a sense it's history all the way down, right? What the develop, and it, we see his logic for it here, right? Because what a science does historically, which in this case just kind of generally means like within time, right? Within the temporal way of things, right? It entraps beings, right? Beings in particular. So any science is fundamentally going to be historical, and so to understand science as such, we need to understand its history, not just not just the simple narrative of what's going on, but its actual nature as a temporal inquiry.
Yeah, I mean, my own view currently is I did read a little bit of William James, and like I do think I'm somewhat pragmatist, and like I think truth is at least for when we're talking about like everyday scientific truth, maybe not philosophical capital T truth, but for everyday truth, I accept the pragmatic definition of truth as like that which works for our purposes. So I guess I'm a pragmatist in that sense, but I do think there is that is historical. There is a historical sense in which what we understand to be like our purposes through which we interpret the world, our schema, so to speak, is historical.
Yeah, I mean Heidegger's response would just be that which works is always going to be a particular working, right?
Yeah, I know he would say that. I'm just saying the reason that I don't necessarily think that's like a problem, just from my perspective, is just because I think we have concepts of what works for at least, and I'm not talking about like philosophy here. Now I'm just more talking about science and everyday living. What I'm saying is when we use instrumental rationality in our day-to-day life, like I just think it's kind of part of our nature. Like we naturally tend to doing things. It's not that we can't question our nature from a philosophical perspective, but in general, I don't. But in general, I think that is like how we live our day-to-day lives. And I do think there's a problem of like rebelling against our nature in such a way that you think that our pragmatic natural attitude is necessarily like a bad thing. I don't even think he's saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying like.
No, well, Heidegger agrees with you. That's how he begins. I mean, this is kind of the sequel in a way to Being in Time. And Being in Time, that's how it starts, is in the everyday pragmatic realm.
But my understanding is that Heidegger says that like we should privilege the philosophical questioning to the everyday pragmatic realm.
No, not the philosophical questioning. It's going to be, for Heidegger, it's sort of the encounter with finitude and the opening of possibility, which remains very pragmatic. At least the way I read him, and the people I know read him.
I mean, I agree with like, I mean, I agree that we should. I mean, my own view is so we have our day to day attitude, but and then we can question that, and then we can look at our finitude, and we can ask the question of being. So I think he's right, but like I'm just saying the reason I don't commit myself to Heideggerianism is just because like from I mean I'm not an expert in his philosophy, but from my understanding, there's many readings of him, especially like Sartre's reading, that's like existence precedes essence, and some ontological commitments that I just don't think I'm ready to make yet.
Gotcha. Well, I'm interested to see how you how things will go for you as we continue.
Yeah, and that's fine.
Um,
And that's fine. Like I'm just saying, I'm just currently growing in my philosophy, and I'm not. I'm just having a hard time committing to like one philosophy because I think different traditions have their grains of truth. But I'm saying Heidegger is certainly an important thinker to dialogue with.
cool. Any other thoughts or comments before we continue from anybody?
No, I can read if you like.
Yeah, sounds good.
It becomes clear that what lies in the limit of science's deliberations is a thematic reflection of the being as such, which is meant in the projection and opening up of the ontological constitution. The founding of science is self-founding, or the laying of its foundation, consists in transforming the pre-ontological understanding of being into an explicit ontological understanding. The latter understanding inquires thematically into the concept of being and into the constitution of being as such. Laying the foundation of science is not as something externally annexed to the science, rather laying the foundation of science of the sciences of beings means developing the pre-ontological understanding of being, which is already necessarily implied in the sciences, in an investigation into the science of being, i.e., in ontology.
Good. Yeah, we actually skipped over something which is important. Well, actually, it was just kind of passively mentioned. But now so at the beginning of this paragraph, he really brings out something that is really important to talk about. Right? How sciences get opened, right? Or how these demarcated lines of inquiry actually get founded, right? He says it's an opening up of the ontology. It's a projection and an opening up of the ontological constitution. Um, and this happens. Okay, well, let's just start with that. Um, so what that is, right? That's like, in the original example, right, of the caveman that I brought up, right? The caveman is thrown into the world, right, and what the hell is this tiger? What the hell is this plant? And then later on, different inquiry, right? A different for Heidegger, right? A different opening up of the ontological, constitution or whatever, the writing on the wall, right? And what does that mean? What is this? How do I interpret this, right? And then there are two different kinds of understanding the world, right? One's biology and one's linguistics, right? Roughly in this crude example, and the reason that happens, right? So this isn't just like kind of this isn't a given, right? I mean, it kind of is, but there's logic behind it. It's an opening up, right? And so there are different sciences in a sense, Heidegger's saying, because different opening ups happen at different points. I mean, not that they're specific discrete points that work out nicely in like a simple like geometric manifold or anything, but it's at different times you will just have different I mean, people describe them as like epiphanies, right, or just discoveries, right? Different things will come into being, and it's like, whoa, that's we. Not everything's the same, right? And so there's this constant opening up, right, and also a projection, right? A projection of what's already understood, a projection of what's already been there, right? Of what has always already been there. That gets projected into the opening up. And so nothing's ever really totally new and nothing's ever really totally old, right? It's this kind of spectrum-ish layout here, right? Of this, what he's calling, right, the constitution, ontological constitution. And so that's really what that's the kind my professor, when he teaches being and time, he really likes to put an emphasis on movement and rhythm. Not that I think necessarily it's always easy or even helpful to, like, especially when you're first encountering Heidegger, to like try to look for specific rhythms or movements, although you certainly could, and my professor's done that. But just understand that in general is kind of a feature of Heidegger's ontology, right? It's a kind of, these aren't just like bullet points or like discrete propositions, right? It's a kind of, it's almost like a big thought experiment that's supposed to mirror our, what has, come to be described as the phenomenological experience, right? It's just it's our what Kirk was describing, right? Our everydayness, right? It's like every day is kind of like this flow, right? It's not super determinate, but at certain points different things pop out at you and other things lay in the background, right? And so that's the kind of general way Heidegger wants us thinking here. I mean, most times, if not all the times, but he's really making that a point here. So I just wanted to point out that that's why different sciences come into being. That's why different beings and different questions pop up, right? Because as we talked about earlier, right, different sciences are demarcated by their initial questions that are limited. And they're limited because different things are being opened up, and we're projecting different things, and so it's a weird back and forth all the time. Okay. Then he says, sorry for talking so much, but this is just, I don't know if this is super clear in the text, and I think it's something that could be made clear through explanation. So the last thing I'll talk about here, he says the latter understanding inquires thematically. So what is the latter understanding? The founding of science is self-founding, or the laying of its foundation consists in transforming the pre-ontological understanding of being into an explicit ontological understanding. Aha. Right. So this is the development of themes, right? Themes are what other philosophers probably call universals, right? And for Heidegger, themes emerge when we take that step back, right? And we say, "Oh, this is kind of similar to that thing, like let's say in that example, the caveman example I keep referring to, right? Let's say your caveman buddy draws a picture of the tiger that you saw earlier, or maybe it's not the specific tiger, right, but it's a tiger, and you can recognize that, and suddenly, even though that's a different kind of science, you see this overlap, and you're like, oh, I can represent a biological being through language. It's a that's a huge opening up. So it's and that's a theme, right? These are different themes, right? Biological themes in literature, right? I mean, that's a huge, people can analyze literature all the time. And then in biology, right? If someone notices I don't know, there's this famous example that actually Zizek likes to talk about, right? When he talks about Niels Bohr and his model of the atom, right? And it came from a dream of the snake eating itself, right? And the snake eating itself, that's I think that's either like a literary or I don't know. Dean's an English literature guy. Dean, do you know where the snake eating itself comes from, or no? That is that from like a religion, or does that come from like a particular like myth or work of writing? Maybe Dean is not here. That's okay.
I looked it up. It says the symbol of a snake eating its own tail is called the Ouroboros. It traces back to ancient Egypt around 1600 BCE, appearing in funerary text.
In which texts?
Funerary text?
Okay. I'm not sure what that is, but the point is it's a text, right? It's a specific text.
Funerals.
Oh, interesting. Okay, cool. Anyway, so the point is that actually, that interpretation was thematically crossed over with science, right? So anyway, the point is themes emerge as a way of organizing in a greater, more abstract, perhaps, way. Or what Heidegger describes, moving from the pre-ontological to the ontological, right? So at that ontological at that ontological greater level, right, we have more of a quote-unquote bird's eye view, or at least a bird's eye understanding, so to speak, right, of these different sciences and how they relate to each other. And it can be more rigorous than that. I'm trying to give easy examples, but anyway. So that's...
you want me to continue reading?
What's that?
So I was just going to say if you want me to continue reading, or if you want me to just finish up a point here.
Maybe just one last point, sorry. Because then he goes on to say what, ontology is, right? And it's this Aristotelian kind of thing, right? Where we want to go into the science of being itself, right? So we're noticing all these themes, right? And from these themes, we notice, science in general has a kind of general process, right? Even though it has different particularities, right, and different limits, we notice general themes, right? And this is eventually. I mean, if you want to go into this, just read Aristotle's metaphysics, and that's basically what he's talking about here, right? And it's an ontology, which is different than metaphysics, and that's important for Heidegger, but we all know that here, so I'm not going to go into that. Okay, yeah. Now, if you want to continue, Kirk, go. Unless you have questions or something about this.
Um, it Since every science always has its field and its region of beings as object, the corresponding ontological reflection always refers to the regional constitution of being, which determines one region. Latent in every science of a realm of beings, there always lies a regional ontology which belongs to this science, but which can never in principle be developed by the science. Yep, more of the same thing. However, the question concerning the ontological constitution of being is not solely limited or primarily referred to a being which is just the object of a factual science, whereas all beings, no matter how accessible they in themselves, can and must be explicated with respect to their ontological constitution, e.g., the world as it is immediately accessible to practical Dasein. So just as I understand it, just can I make a quick
Oh yeah.
point real quick? As I understand when he's saying this, I hear. As I understand it, echo.
Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say, as I understand, when Heidegger is talking about practical Dasein here, Dasein for Heidegger is basically the capital B being of time, and that is what human beings and other beings who can ask the question of being reflect on.
It's a good question. There is like I guess you could think about it that way. So the way I understand Dasein is being there, because that's literally what it translates to into English from German, right? Or it's more of like a there being, right? Because da means there and sein means being, basically. So it's a being there, and right. So you could take that as the general being. But I've always interpreted it more as a kind of individuality, because being there sort of implies a there-ness, and that sort of implies like a specific spatio-temporality. So I always kind of just took that to mean like individuality, like a kind of individualized experience, personally, for that reason.
Yeah. Well, so the way I understand Heidegger when he's talking about Dasein, it's like the being that is, it's a capital B being that makes lowercase b beings possible, and then human beings can reflect on Dasein through, and basically they can, by, as I understand it, the existential hermeneutic is by reflecting on our own mortality. We recognize the significance of existence, and when we recognize the significance of existence, we see what is the condition for the existence of lowercase b beings, and as capital B being, which is basically time or the horizon of lowercase b beings. An authentic Dasein is when Dasein basically is reflected upon by usually human beings, although there are other. I know Derrida talks about like animals, and although I don't think Derrida is. Right, but like some people say like animals too. But in any event, at least human beings, because we can reflect on this question of existence, we have the ability to reflect on to use more Kantian language, transcendental conditions for the possibility of lowercase b beings, and that, as I understand it, is temporality.
Yeah, yeah. I think at some point it was a little jumbled. Specifically, it's not through reflecting on our mortality that we understand the transcendental conditions and being qua being, but it's reverse. Um, the existential analytic leads to the understanding of being towards death as um, the sort of culmination finite being. And it's also not just mortality. It's not just like life and death in a binary sense. It's sort of slow dying. I mean, this is a lot of existential depressing themes come out of Heidegger, and this is probably at least the main driver behind it. I would guess. It's the realization that everything is dying all the time. is the best way I can describe it. It's really sucky. It's but for Heidegger, it's not. It's ecstatic for Heidegger, and possibilities open up within one's own finitude.
Yeah.
But
So,
right,
so I understand. I think I understand that. So it's not. I'm sorry. I think I got the existential analytic reversed. It's not that you have basically being towards death, and that leads to recognizing the significance of being qua being. It is that you look when you do a phenomenological investigation of being qua being, you then recognize being towards death. And I understand. And by the way, I understand when Heidegger's talking about death, he's not talking about physical death. I just meant more the process of dying, which is basically the process of lack of the process of new possibilities, which means when those new possibilities come in, you lack what you used to be, as I understand Heidegger's understanding of that.
um, I think it's an understanding of your own limitations, and therefore simultaneously, like, you're gonna die one day. So, for example, right, or the even just an easier example, just to make the stereotype less true and to get more of the nuance. The day's gonna end, right, and I'm gonna have to sleep at some point. That reveals possibilities, right, because it reveals, oh, okay, well, I have, you know, uh, if I'm gonna sleep, then these other things are true, and I need well, not just true in like a logical sense, right? But it motivates action in you, right? It's like, or the sun's gonna set, I need a house, to live, right? That's why Heidegger describes as, going back to the text especially, right? Immediately accessible to practical Dasein, right? It's like that's the culmination of that, right? Is being towards death, and it can be as simple as the day's gonna end. I need shelter. That's a possibility
Yeah.
revealed through being towards death, as I understand it. Anyway, does that make
Well,
sense?
but that, yeah, but that just sounds like what I said, but with more examples. Like I'm pretty sure when I was saying it, I just meant that exactly that. Because you have limited time within a given context, you that limited time means that you have limited possibilities, and so authentic Dasein lets these possibilities flow. And that's kind of my understanding of his more of his ethical philosophy is exactly to have an openness to being and not be consumed by instrumental rationality.
Yep. I'd say that's all
But again,
true.
the reason I disagree, just real quick, the reason that I disagree with Heidegger though is because like I just think like instrumental rationality is kind of like it's just kind of baked into like our decision making in the sense that like whenever I get up, I mean this is more appealing to like phenomenology or like in a broader sense of like what is our lived experience like phenomenologically. I do need to eat and take a poo and pee and but in order to achieve these things I need technology in order to sustain myself, and if I want something I'm going to go after it. So just like I feel like pragmatism is kind of the default mode, and I'm not saying he's not saying that, but I'm just saying I wouldn't fight against the default mode. I think people are content with living that. That's
Right.
just my
I
own view
mean,
though.
maybe I'll just I'll leave it there because I want to return to the text. But yeah, these are good thoughts. Yeah, I would just say consider what Heidegger says about um, inauthentic Dasein, but we can have a conversation about that another point because we need to. I think
Yeah.
we should move on. But good conversations. Okay. Do you want to keep reading?
Yeah,
Should I
sorry,
read?
my someone's knocking on my door, so you're gonna have to read.
Okay, that's fine. Okay. All ontological inquiry objectifies being as such. All ontic investigation objectifies beings. But the ontic objectification is possible only on the basis and through the ontological, that is pre-ontological, projection and opening up of the ontological constitution. At the same time, the ontological inquiry and the objectification of being also need an original founding. This will be carried out by the investigation which we would call fundamental ontology. Taken in this universal and radical sense, ontology is nothing other than philosophy's way of being. Of course, so far we've only determined this way of being in an unrefined consideration of the scope, and we do not yet know anything of the enigmas that are concealed at the center of the philosophical problematic of fundamental ontology. It suffices to see now what we mean by the laying of foundation of the science of beings, which gets accomplished as ontology and as is enacted in philosophy. So this is interesting. This is actually my first encounter with Heidegger defining philosophy. I think.
Yeah.
Maybe I missed it in being in time, or I just don't remember. But he just seems to make a separation here, which I haven't seen before. This is new to me, which gets accomplished as ontology and is enacted in philosophy. Maybe it's
Yeah.
not a separation.
You know-
Maybe I'm just misreading that, but that's interesting to me. I don't really understand that
Can I-
totally. What's
Go
up?
ahead. I'm sorry, were you gonna say something? Because I actually have something to say about this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I actually prefer Karl Jaspers' definition of philosophy, which is basically Jaspers defines philosophy as the questioning of things which are outside of the scope of objectification. And so basically, Jaspers kind of takes this Kierkegaardian philosophy of like leap of faith, where for things which are existentially undecidable, like we can't know if we should use reason or faith. For example, you can't use reason to justify reason, and so Kierkegaard, as I understand it, says that so for some things we have to take a leap of faith. Jaspers defines philosophy as basically taking a leap of faith where questions can't be answered. So he accepts sort of the Kantian tradition of like that. Well, we can't know if God exists or God doesn't exist because that's an antinomy, and I agree with that as of now. So it basically in this existentialist tradition of Kierkegaard and Jaspers say we should have faith, whereas Heidegger is saying it's not about faith; it's more about having a science of beings as ontology. So I think he's breaking from the religious existentialist here. So sorry if that was a little bit long-winded, but that's my understanding.
Yeah, no, that could be it. I just don't understand what enacted means versus like what is the difference between. Oh, I guess as such is enacted in philosophy. I just find it weird, like, which gets accomplished as ontology and as such is enacted in philosophy. Maybe he's just acknowledging that philosophy has like a greater historical tradition, and he's like, no, ontology is what like philosophy should be doing, and philosophy does it sometimes, but now we're doing it fundamental ontology. I don't know.
Yeah, but would you say that what I was saying like about the difference between him and religious existentialists is like they're going at it things from a less. I mean, not that Heidegger's a systematic philosopher; he's not. But like, I don't think Heidegger is a systematic philosopher, but he's more systematic, I think, than like the people I named about who focus more on like religious existentialism. The Heidegger's looking at it from a more phenomenological perspective, whereas they're looking at more from like a how do we answer questions where we can't have an answer using systematic methods.
Um, there certainly does seem to be a difference in those approaches. I haven't read a whole lot of the like religious existentialism, honestly. So I definitely want to do
Yeah.
more of that. I guess for now I'll just say that I mean yeah, there's a similarity. It reminds me of the like what I understand is sort of the fundamental difference between I guess what ended up being like the late Schelling and Hegel, where Hegel thought philosophy could comprehend the absolute, and Schelling says that philosophy leads to sort of its own failure, and so the absolute is necessarily like outside of philosophy. Um, and yeah, I guess Heidegger would fall more into this like sort of Hegelian idea of yeah, we can understand fundamental ontology, and so we can sort of grasp, you know, philosophy. We can grasp, existence as such.
Yeah.
um,
That's part of why I said we should read either Karl Jaspers's book General Psychopathology, or if you want to read into Kierkegaard, because I've read a little bit of Kierkegaard, but not much. I'm definitely interested in these thinkers because not just because I'm religious. I mean, I am religious, but also because like I think it's interesting as like a contrast.
Yeah, yeah, it's an interesting contrast. It's one I think about a good amount conceptually. So yeah, I agree. I mean, we can just see what they say. But for now, yeah, Heidegger, yeah, fundamental ontology all the way. Yeah, I think I do fall more on the I don't know. I don't know. I'm like I don't know. In a way, I think they're kind of the same. Not in the Heidegger sense, but at least if we go like the because for Hegel, at least in my interpretation, grasping the absolute is grasping reason's failure, and so I do think that can be grasped, but I also think that like the general attitude should be shifted outside of just comprehension towards other things
Yeah.
like action. And so okay, but we'll talk about that more. But this is a good thing to keep in mind. Okay, do you want to read, Kirk, or should I keep going?
Onward.
Okay.
Now we're able to grasp more clearly what these generalities are all about, up against which every science comes and from which it retreats as something underdetermined, or about which it babbles irresponsibly, as indeed it also happens. What is presumably a vague and underdetermined generality has its own determination, necessity, and particular comprehensibility. So far in our deliberations, we continually spoke of what is to be understood in advance with respect to beings, i.e., what is already opened up and projected in advance and thus must be somehow be unconcealed for a being to encounter as a being. When an advance determines a being as a being, the constitution of being which first makes possible a being as the being that it is, and with in is what in a certain sense is earlier than a being is a priori. Sorry, this was a lot to
No,
read.
that's okay. That's good. Thank you. Yeah. Here we have a priori from the Heideggerian perspective, right?
Yeah.
um, yeah. So the a priori is just the constitution of the being, which first makes possible a being as the being that it is. So it's something. Basically its essence, right? Or its nature, or just its core. All these things get at this idea of what Heidegger means by the a priori. Uh, but not just something that it is, but what makes possible, right? So it's a very Kantian kind of, basically what Kant means by transcendental, is essentially what Heidegger means by a priori.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. um, okay, cool. It's an existential a priori, so that's good to know. Okay, any questions or comments, or should we move on?
Then the question is the statement true? Which is, would you say it's fair to say when Heidegger's talking about a priori, he means a priori in a more phenomenological sense of like, how, like for example, he talks about like mood, or which as I understand for Heidegger is like the mood of the time, or like the general feeling people have at a certain within a certain culture. But like, would you say when he's talking about a priori, he means more like the sort of affective. I mean, I know emotion would be too ontic, not ontological, but more, but to use a very colloquial metaphor, like emotional or affective um, thing for that makes like meaning possible compared to Kant, who's talking about a priori in a more epistemological sense.
Yeah, I just described it as an existential a priori. So it's whatever determines the a specific being within the context of the constitution of being as such.
Yeah,
So it's
but what I was saying
basically
is that for
it's
Heidegger,
something's relation. Here's how I'll just understand it. It's something's relation to being qua being. Like in what
yeah,
ways does it branch off from being as its root, as its ontological root?
yeah. But my understanding is that that is for Heidegger related more to like what I mean, it's not emotions, but like
Well,
to
yeah,
use a
it's
colloquial
phenomenological. It's
metaphor,
existential.
emotions.
It's going to be lived. It's going to be right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm saying the colloquial metaphor for that would be something like emotions or affect.
No, because thought counts too.
Oh yeah, well, thought, but I'm saying for Heidegger, as I understand it, he kind of has like a Humean view where we have these like emotions or affects first, and then we think about things afterwards.
Not necessarily.
Okay, I thought that was Heidegger's view. I could have been wrong. So sure.
Well, it's phenomenological, so it's lived, and sometimes we we'll see more what he means specifically, but just to try to like demarcate the difference like now between like an empiricist thing and like um what Heidegger's thinking, it's just like yeah, affect is a good way to understand it, but like a lot of the it's closer, but it's like spontaneity on the part of like probably what Husserl would call the ego is certainly something that is also within this. Like if you just come up with something on your own that you've never seen before, um, for Hume that's just going to be like a simple association of impressions. But I think the phenomenologists have more of a lot of this is going to come down to the issue of the imagination, and imagination isn't just it's more complicated in this tradition than it is in Hume, where it's just like a mere like reproduction of past impressions, because not everything is like an impression for a phenomenologist. It's like it's more of just like a general lived experience, if that makes sense. Like it's not
Yeah.
like
Well, that's why I said yeah. But this
Hume's
is why I said
looking
that's
at
why I
it
said
from the lens
emotion.
of like a subject being impressed upon by an object, and for Hume these things are very clear. A phenomenologist, especially like for Heidegger, that's just not clear.
Yeah, well, that's why I said emotion is like a metaphor I would use. I wouldn't. I'm not saying it is about emotions. I'm just saying metaphorically, it's similar to like emotion, and then we make a decision. But really, it's more just there is the world, and then Dasein. Um, Basically, you reflect on Dasein, and then there's a decision. But it's not. You're right. It's not Humean. I just meant as like an analogy.
I don't know. I still think that that analogy is a little too loaded. I just think it's its own thing that can't really
Okay.
have an analog besides just literally your lived experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
If you can, that'd be appreciated.
Yeah, I'll pick it up. To be sure, what is in advance of a being and understood earlier than a being is actually grasped later and latest. Certainly, we can examine a being in the preliminary stage of a science, like the knowledge of nature before the emergence of modern natural science. Oh, that was like my example, right? Like a caveman being exposed to, like a creature or plant for the first time. He's not doing natural science, right? He's just going like, whoa, like, what is that? In the very initial, what Heidegger would call a primitive question, I think. Okay. Without developing an explicit understanding of being with regard to specific beings. On the other hand, it is a fact that it is the sciences that have developed from out of philosophy, and that in antiquity individual sciences were called individual philosophies. Here a rather obscure knowledge gets manifest, according to which all reflection on beings and all science already understand being, and depend on this stage of the development of this understanding of being for their possibility. So I think Heidegger's saying this is interesting. We used to develop specific sciences out of just different, like, again, what I think Heidegger would call primitive lived experiences, right? Like it's that sort of initial, like, kind of very easy to understand opening up of the ontological constitution, right? Like I was describing, where you're kind of just looking around and different things appear to you, and some things are new, and you're like, whoa, that's crazy. Like if it like in a I don't know, in a horror movie, right? When the monster gets just revealed out of the darkness, right? It's like, what the fuck, you know? Like, it's scary, right? So that's a very, primitive, I think what Heidegger would call, like, primitive understanding. But then he says something weird happened where we stopped developing, right? Because that's how people develop science, according to Heidegger, right? It's like people took these things and asked more and more, rigorously with more specification what this thing is, right? And accumulated more facts about it, right? But then it changed, he says, and it's really interesting, right? Especially in antiquity, right? Because then we started, and actually, Kirk, maybe this is a good thing to explain the difference, right, between just like why I thought maybe affect wasn't the best way to explain it, right? Because that sort of is affect, right? Or at least what most people would take the affect, right? But then, he's saying something different happened. But it's still phenomenological and existential, right? But it's a different, maybe like mode, right? Of that, according to Heidegger, we just start asking questions first, right? Maybe nothing, maybe nothing affects us in particular, but we sort of just ask a question anyway, right? It's what if, right? What if this happened? What what if this being existed? What would that be like? Or what if an atom was arranged in this way? Or what if a creature had this feature? Or what if man could fly? Like, what if? And then boom, aerodynamics, right? Science of aerodynamics. It's like I was looking for a good example. Maybe that's one. Okay, so I think that's what's happening here. There's a difference in the way we are developing sciences, in a different way, to use the language from just, not too long ago, right? Opening up and projection, right? We're new way of doing that. Maybe it's a much more of a projecting of a, maybe abstract opening up. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. Anything you say about that, Kirk, or no?
No, I mean that makes sense. I think that's why it would not be affect. I meant it as a metaphor, but yeah, I think that you're right. It's not a great metaphor. I do think though Heidegger is, in one sense, closer to Hume than to Kant, which is I think Kant's understanding of like the imagination is like this more intellectualized thing, whereas Heidegger has more of a emphasis on like what Hume would call habit or custom, although Heidegger wouldn't use those words, I think. But I do think Heidegger's view of reason is closer to Hume than Kant. In some senses. I mean, he is obviously a post-Kantian. I just mean like in a conceptual sense.
Yeah, I wonder, because I do think this is a place where that sort of gets shifted. I think this is more of a Kantian view. This is sort of reason, following its principles, and approaching science in a much more philosophical way. That, maybe Hume wouldn't put out of the question, but I do think that it's a much more Kantian way of thinking about what's going on than Hume would.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair, and I think that you're definitely more knowledgeable about the history of philosophy than I am. It's just the reason that's where my mind went was just because of the fact that when you're talking about the history of these things in the Hume, like Adam Smith tradition, there is like an emphasis of like as I understand the tradition of custom and practice, like pragmatism, and not as much on like principle. And I think Heidegger, as I understand it, his view of reason is he doesn't have like a view of principles as like these a priori categories in the same way Kant did.
Well, we'll see. That issue's going to come up later. He does account for it in a way. And this is maybe also what I meant before when I said Kant and Heidegger are maybe more similar than a lot of people think. This is an area because here, let's just see what I'll just repeat this line that I really like. On the other hand, it is a fact that it is the sciences that have developed from out of philosophy, and that in antiquity, individual sciences were called individual philosophies. Actually, I'll just continue it, right? Here, a rather obscure knowledge gets manifest, according to which all reflections on being and all science already understand being, and depend on this stage of the development of this understanding of being for their possibility. I think that this is the sort of emergence of a more directly Kantian reason. This is the principled reasoning that we're seeing, right? That he is just kind of acknowledging. That's what he means by obscure, I think. It's obscure because it's not custom. It's not custom. That's what makes it obscure. It's strange. It's out of the ordinary. But we're still doing it because it already understands being, right? It already understands cognition in a way, right? Maybe not to the level of like transcendental reflection, but it understands reason, and there's a sort of base self consciousness there, out of which we develop philosophies based on just lines of reasoning that go along with reason itself, and not merely custom or habit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does.
Yeah, and you're right. It's not Kantian all the way down, but I do think Kantian reason is present here. That's my theory, anyway. So hopefully that makes sense. But you're right. It's going to be encapsulated for Heidegger in a greater phenomenological schema, if you will, and we'll see that more come clear later. Okay, are you cool with reading this one, Kirk?
Yeah, sure, if you want me to.
Yes, just because I'm going to use the bathroom. I'll be back in probably before you're done. So I'll be right back. But please read.
All science is potentially and in principle philosophy, but philosophy itself is contained in the ground of human Dasein as factical possibility. For when we offered a preliminary characterization of Dasein, we saw that Dasein exists, that is, in a world, and that it exists in such a way that as to comport itself toward beings in the world and toward itself as a being. But it has now become clear that this comportment toward beings is grounded in the prior understanding of all of the beings of being, of the being of beings, which is de facto and for the most part a pre-ontological understanding of being. This understanding of being makes possible for the first time the existing understanding of being. This understanding of being makes possible for the first time the existing comportment of Dasein toward its world, in each case and toward itself. Accordingly, the understanding of being is the most original condition for the possibility of human existence. In a certain sense, this understanding of being becomes explicit in the sciences. This understanding of being is conceptualized in relation to certain realms of being, which the sciences have demonized. It is in ontology, i.e., philosophy, that being becomes explicitly and specifically a thematic object. Okay, I'm just waiting for you. Adu, 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 what, adu, 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 adu.
Okay, I'm back. Do you need me to scroll?
Yes, please.
All right, sorry about that.
So, okay. Philosophy that being becomes explicitly thematic object. Accordingly, philosophy becomes a freely undertaken task of elucidating and unfolding the understanding of being which belongs to the essence of human existence. But precisely because understanding of being as such, either as pre-ontological or ontological, is the most original and necessary condition for the possibility of human existence, the understanding of the task of elucidation of this understanding, i.e. philosophy, is the freest possibility of human existence. Only where the most original necessity is binding, only there is the highest freedom from first possible.
Cool. That sounds like a cool paragraph. I just joined for the last half, or honestly, I guess fourth or something of that. But it sounds Spinozist here at the end. I mean, do you agree or no?
The notes, I haven't read a lot of Spinoza. I've read a little bit. I think there is a conceptual parallel here. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this last sentence, where the most original necessity is binding, only there is the highest freedom possible. I mean, that could have come straight out of Spinoza, right? Only in our most fundamental necessity is that the sense in which we are free. So
Yeah, I mean that is kind of what. But my understanding is that Heidegger's view of free will is a little bit different from Spinoza. Because Heidegger. So as I understand it, from the history of Spinoza, he had ideas of conatus, which is basically the conatus, as I understand it, is Latin for basically something which tries to preserve its own existence. And then sort of you have this tradition of like Nietzsche taking this up with like the idea of like the will to power. But Heidegger, even though he was very influenced by Nietzsche, did kind of reject Nietzsche to some extent, that he rejected both Spinoza and Nietzsche on this point, that there's like this striving for self-preservance, because for Heidegger he rejected the idea that like the will is this fundamental thing.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't about will. It's just about freedom as such. I mean, and for Spinoza, there's no free will, and for Heidegger,
I know.
there
Spinoza's saying
isn't.
there's no free will, but I'm saying, but can I elaborate why I made that point?
Yeah.
Because it's it's basically what I'm saying is that Spinoza says we don't have free will because we're driven by our conatus, right? We're driven by basically our striving for self-preservation, which is like affective and emotional, as I understand it for Spinoza. And so, but Heidegger did not think of it in this like will-based or like based on like desire or based on like conatus, or like he would think all these like ontic things where he's doing ontology, Spinoza's doing ontic science.
Well, that's what the issue of human will, but their understanding of freedom is the same here.
Oh, yeah, but I'm saying that for the reason Spinoza rejected free will is because he has this view of human will.
Sure, but the will isn't an issue here. I'm just saying freedom itself. Like, what does freedom mean in general?
Oh
And
yeah, I mean yeah,
it's basically
that
the
you're right.
same. It's within original being, right? As such, the highest, right? Spinoza, right? The substance, nature, God, right? It's the cause of the cause. This is the exactly the same. It's not existentially. Heidegger is going to want to differentiate himself, right? Ontologically, but it's the same structure of the concept, right? It's the same thing, right? It's only this exact thing could have come out of Spinoza, right? Sentence at least. So, um, because that's what makes the human being possible, right? Which is also what Spinoza would agree with in structure at least. So, okay, well let's see what he said at the beginning here that I missed. Um, Oh, right, the stuff Spinoza would disagree with. Okay, yeah. So again, it's in a different context, but yeah, he's just saying, right? It's what he said at the beginning, basically, right? Dasein. Yeah, when we offer a. So he's just recalling, right? When we uh, science started by orienting ourselves towards being in a certain way, right? That's what allows for the projection and the opening up, right? In the first place, right? Is that initial orientation and comportment towards being a particular being. Um, it's grounded in a prior understanding, right? So there's this kind of latent understanding in Heidegger, right? So in some sense we understand it, right? Because it's so factical, we're living it out, right? I mean, we're all living towards being towards death, right? We all actually are being towards death in some sense, but we just might not understand it like consciously, right? But this is the situation which Heidegger says we do understand, or it's there, and it is a prior understanding. It's just it's prior. It hasn't become upfront yet, and that's what makes science possible. That's what makes ontology, philosophy possible. Um, and it's what and so all right, ontology, that is philosophy. So these are the same, right? Fundamental ontology, philosophy, they're the same for Heidegger. So I think I was making too much of a deal out of that separation earlier. That being becomes explicitly and specifically a thematic object, right? So this is where we actually So what was latent before is now becoming clear in the science of ontology, fundamental ontology, or philosophy, right? The way Heidegger's doing philosophy here. That's that's how we understand the essence of human existence, which is existence, right? Which is the factical.
Well, yeah, and my understanding is that I mean, I haven't read Sartre, so I could be wrong about this. My understanding is that the difference between Heidegger and Sartre, though, is Sartre says existence precedes essence, whereas Heidegger says existence is essence.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I got to read Sartre too, to be honest. So I'm also going to bite my tongue there, but it's an interesting. That's an interesting distinction. And a distinction I think I'm actually really interested in buying into, given my own Kantian leanings. So, yeah, no, everyone was who read my thesis, or at least a part of it, was like, "Yo, you got to read Sartre." so, I feel like I'm going to be inclined to really be into that distinction. But right, because for Heidegger they're the same. I don't think that, but
Yeah,
Heidegger
I'm
thinks
actually
so.
probably closer to Heidegger. I'm actually probably closer to Heidegger than Sartre on this.
That's interesting. Cool. All right. Yeah. Right. But that's how we understand what makes it possible to be a human being. So, and thus we realize freedom in ontology. And ontology, spoiler, is going to be temporality. Right? So freedom is found in our finitude. Um, which is, yeah, opposite of Spinoza in a way, right? Because freedom is found in the infinite nature of substance. But, okay. Let's just leave the conversation behind because that's not going to get anywhere, at least right now. Do you want me to?
No, I mean we didn't. Just to clarify, I don't think we disagreed. I was just saying, yeah,
Yep.
you're right. So,
Cool.
I want me to continue reading, or can you read? So the reason I asked if you can read is just got to wash my hands real quick.
Yeah, I'll read. Okay. The science of beings have inherently a factical necessity, and we can take up these sciences, study them, even work on the intentions which guide their research, without being bothered by the philosophy which necessarily lies in these sciences, although hidden. Um, sorry, some came up. Or without being bothered by philosophy as such. So, without being bothered by philosophy of science, or without being bothered by philosophy in general. Things work without philosophy, and one can sneak away from philosophy. One can do that precisely because philosophy is a matter of the highest freedom. One can sneak away from philosophy, and then everything is left as it is. But one can also freely take up philosophy as the most radical necessity of human existence. Of course, this occurs only when individual existence understands itself, which always means when the individual existence decides to understand itself. Kirk, are you back yet? I don't.
I never left. I was just washing my hands. Sorry.
Oh well, okay. Sorry, I assumed you were going to a different room for that. Okay. Or otherwise away from your device. So sorry for that misunderstanding. But yeah, this is fascinating. I mean, you wouldn't expect this from such like a grounded phenomenological philosopher, right? Or maybe you would, but I wouldn't. But I'm not used to hearing Heidegger. He doesn't talk about this way in Being in Time anyway. But right here, he's just like he's talking like Hegel, right? Philosophy provides the human being the highest freedom, and only by actually, encountering the most high moment, right, of human existence, can we actually attain that freedom? But you can walk away from it.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what. Yeah, that's kind of what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about like why I disagree with his critique of instrumental rationalities. Because I mean, we don't have to get too deep into it now, but because it's not directly relevant to the Heidegger reading, but it's just saying my own perspective is in our day-to-day thing, like we have our freedom to make our decisions, and like we don't need to have this ontological. I would not recommend people ask the ontological question. I mean, for a select few, if you want to, that's fine. But I'm just saying, I don't have the same prescription Heidegger has about authenticity.
Oh, right. So you don't think that like philosophy is necessarily the highest freedom, or that like doing it is like the way to which we can like attain the freedom? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think our freedom is basically. I mean, my own view of like freedom and like free will is like I think like I said previously, I think we have these and I think this is William James. It's we have a stream of consciousness which we can't control what thoughts pop up in our head, but we can control volitionally whether to focus our thoughts on what pops up in our head. And this ability to focus, I think, is what freedom is about. And that focus has nothing to do with authenticity or inauthenticity. It just has to do with basically the freedom to. It's just a volitional ability to focus on the contents of our thought. I mean, that's really just it, in my view.
Yeah. I think Heidegger's argument here is that um, is that um, there's a moment in which one will uh, one will sort of encounter philosophy, and of course that's like, the existence doing it itself. But I think it might, to the uninitiated, it might just seem kind of like a wild kind of contingent thing. But he's like, no, this is actually within our existence, right? This is the structure of it, right? And the reason that is the case is because of thematization, right? um, that seems to be the transition from practical doing to doing philosophy, and in Heidegger's view, gaining freedom. And the reason that's freedom is because it is necessarily following the pattern of thematization. And so one can obviously choose to thematize or not, to a non-practical extent, but one won't gain freedom that way. And of course, Heidegger, stays very practical pretty much always. And I think Heidegger might argue that, maybe you'll see possibilities practically that you didn't see without, you know, realizing this freedom. So it's an interesting thing to, right? Because, and that's not even a baseless claim, right? Because in Heidegger's logic, right, this is through thematization. So if you do the ultimate thematizing, more possibilities, right? More themes of more ontological constitution is opened up to you, and you can project into it more. Um, I guess one could say effectively, although Heidegger would say freely, right? So maybe I don't know, but I'm kind of just this is a new kind of way of understanding Heidegger for me through thematization, which is cool. It seems like a more Husserlian way. I'm used to like the being in time way of just like Kirk was saying, the authenticity, but I think this is more easily understandable and a bit more flows with the logic of scientific reasoning, which is interesting.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I would like to read Husserl with you. Not that I would agree with him, but like just as a, again, he's also an important thinker to be in dialogue with historically. I do gotta get going in like 8 minutes, but sorry about that. So if we can just continue reading, like read one more paragraph and then talk about it, and then I do gotta get going. But this was I think a very fruitful study.
Oh yeah, we're actually about to finish the section. Do you want to just do that and then call it?
Sure.
It's
Or
two more
actually, but if
paragraphs.
it's yeah, but these paragraphs look a little bit beefy, so if you could read that would be appreciated. Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. So, by way of a summary, we can say that science's self-founding needs a founding in turn because a pre-ontological understanding of being belongs to this founding. A pre-ontological understanding which the sciences of beings are in principle incapable of illuminating. The founding of self-founding of sciences of being takes place in regional ontologies. Thus, ontology is what first accomplishes the laying of the foundation of an ontic science. Laying the foundation of a science of beings means founding and developing the ontology which underlies the science. In turn, these ontologies are grounded in fundamental ontology, which constitutes the center of philosophy. Every science of beings necessarily contains in itself a latent, more or less developed ontology which supports that science and founds it. So, Kirk, here's actually a more elaborate response to your viewpoint, I think, just this paragraph, right? To have that practical focus that at least James, or at least your reconstruction of James's viewpoint is talking about, we need to assume a fundamental ontology. And not only do we need to assume that, but the very process of focusing, I think how James is talking about it for Heidegger, that's going to be based on thematizing. And we need to thematize to some extent. And the more we thematize, the more we become consciously aware of our presupposition of fundamental existential ontology. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, not in the sense like I agree with Heidegger here, but in the sense that like, yeah, I think I understand that.
Okay, cool. All right, I'll just read the last paragraph then. After elucidating, laying the foundation of, after elucidating what laying the foundation of a science means, we are sufficiently prepared to move on to our next question. Why is for Kant the founding of metaphysics a science of supersensible beings, a critique of pure reason? Okay, so now we're gonna get into Kant next time. We're gonna end it, I think, here or in just a few minutes. But all of this is important for understanding Kant, according to Heidegger, right? Because this is going to reveal the relationship between the metaphysics, well, just metaphysics, science, and the specific science of supersensible beings, and then a critique of pure reason. Because if you're not aware, in the critique of pure reason, that's what Kant claims, that metaphysics actually is a science of supersensible. Well, not just supersensible in general. He means specifically necessitated by reason, beyond the application of what he calls categories to what ends up being sensible experience through synthesis. It's a lot, but that's specifically what he means by supersensible. And Kant claims that that's a science. And then the way to understand that foundation for Kant is through critiquing that faculty of reason, pure reason, that allows us to get to these supersensible beings. Because that, for Kant, that's pure reason, and he critiques it. So I this is where my disagreements start in the reading of Kant. I don't think Kant is founding it as a... Well, okay, I do think he's founding it as a science, but I don't think you're supposed to take that as just any science. Kant's very clear that it's illusory, but it's necessary. It's scientific in its necessity, but it's illusory. But which actually, it pisses me off. Heidegger kind of refuses to acknowledge that. So, and I think both this and Kant's critique of in both this work and Kant, the problem of metaphysics. So, I think that's really dumb. But so already it's kind of misleading, and I'm disagreeing with Heidegger. But okay, but that's what he means, kind of. I'll leave the rest of my disagreements for... That's probably what most of the rest of this book is going to be me talking about. So let's leave that for then. We'll see you next time for section 3, laying the foundation of metaphysics as a science of the critique of pure reason. Kirk, what do you want to say anything before we go, or talk about anything?
Yeah, just Heideggerian wisdom of the day: don't be a naive physicalist.
True. Yeah. Good point. Yeah. What is my Heideggerian wisdom of the day? You know, I'm gonna piggyback off Kurt and just say, no, not Kurt, piggyback off Kirk and say, you know, don't be naive in general. And in that light, what that implies is understand regional ontologies, that they are regional, and don't be afraid to encounter... Well, I guess be afraid if you know, that's just what happens, but you know, don't shy away from freedom. I you know, I kind of do agree with Heidegger here in some sense, not in this super factical lived sense, at least I think, as much as he means it, and we'll get into that with synthesis and syndosis and all that. But I think the spirit of what he's saying here is very true. I do think that there is an encounter. Well, what will seem like it. I don't know if I'd frame it entirely as an encounter, but I do think there's a moment. Let's just call it a moment. Let's be Hegelian, I guess, in that sense for a second. There is a moment in which, you know, one will question, and one will understand oneself. You know, maybe a little too well for comfort, and I think that's super important. That's basically what my thesis was about. I think that basically my argument is that actually is what allows... That's the conditions of possibility for an ethics, in my view. This is my own philosophy that I derive from Kant and Lacan. Yeah, it's my stance is that it is not possible to have an ethics, which I define as essentially an orientation, which I'm already kind of questioning, but so maybe my definition of ethics will get altered, but I still think whatever ethics is, it is not possible without this this moment that Heidegger describes here, even if it's not exactly as factical as he does. So anyway, all that's to say, we'll talk more about my thesis probably later, because most used a lot of this for it, and also because of that, yeah, don't shy away from this. I think this will make you ethical. That's what I'll say. Okay, I'll save the rest for later because this has gone on for a while. Okay, any last things, Kirk, or should we sign off here?
I think we should sign off.
Alrighty, farewell, everybody.